Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jayanathan, Executive Director of AMCHAM Korea. Welcome to our 49th webinar on the Energy and Environment Committee meeting. There's an ambitious plan by the Korean government to partner with the private sector to accelerate the energy transition. This investment opportunity seems to attract great interest from both domestic and foreign companies. Effective partnership between the government and the private sector is mandatory, and this webinar will explore ways in which some changes to the regulatory, technical, and commercial environment can assist a successful energy transition for Korea. Today, we'll be joined by John Walker, co-chair of AMCHAM's Energy and Environment Committee and the Asia chairman of Glenfarne Group, along with three expert speakers from Glenfarne Group, Kim and Chang and Baker Hughes, who will guide us through this session. Ricky Kim is currently the country head of Glenfarne Companies in Korea, a New York-based operator for energy and infrastructure assets. While Ricky has over 16 years of experience in the power development industry, his geographical expertise in power development is not limited to Korea, but also includes Asia and the American continents. Ryan Russell, a foreign attorney from Kim and Chang, specializes in renewable energy, project finance, foreign direct investment, energy, and acquisition finance practices. His activities as Kim and Chang's RE100 desk member will inform us as to how renewable energy can blend into Korea's energy transition. Lastly, Kevin Jayanathan is a sales director at Baker Hughes with over 8 years of experience in sales. Kevin will guide us through the key factors of the energy industry, including regulation, contract, and commercial aspect for a successful energy transition within the Asia-Pacific nations. We hope this webinar can inform you on the practical side of the energy transition for the future and also act as a reference for the business's energy demand in the most efficient way. Should you have any questions, please be sure to address them only during the Q&A session at the end and not on the chat function. Also, please do not miss the opportunity to hear more about energy and environment on our upcoming AMCHAM Sustainability Seminar on August 27th. Thank you, and the floor is yours, John.
Thank you so much, Juge, for that introduction, and a very thorough introduction, which makes my role as the chairman of today's session a much easier role. Thank you. As Juge is pointing out, energy transition themes are gaining increasing attention amongst companies, given the Korean government's very aggressive plans in the renewable energy and energy transition sector. However, as is often the case, there can be a gap between well-intentioned policy and regulation and the ability of the private sector to deliver. So part of the theme for today's session is to address some of those issues. Today, we'll be focusing on LNG, which is a very, very important topic given the government's plans to replace at least 5 gigawatts of coal-fired power with LNG, and also focusing on offshore wind, both from a regulatory point of view and also from a technical point of view. In the future, I hope that we can be talking about blue and green hydrogen and be talking about rare earths and critical minerals and their importance for electric vehicles and turbines, etc. But as I said, today our focus will be around LNG and offshore wind. Juge has introduced the speakers. What I'd suggest to the speakers is that rather than me introduce you again individually, that when you've completed your presentation, please pass the ball along the line to the next speaker. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce Ricky Kim from Glenfarne Group, which is an emerging energy player in the region and a well-established energy player in the US. I'm sure Ricky will touch a little on Glenfarne. So thank you all for joining, and Ricky, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you, John, for your introduction, brief introduction. Okay, I'll be the first speaker for LNG sector in Korea. And before starting the presentation, let me briefly introduce who Glenfarne is to you gentlemen and ladies. Glenfarne is a relatively new company, just established in 2011, headquartered in New York and Texas. And also we are doing some power businesses in South America, which is quite successful up to now, and also developing midstream LNG project in US, Texas, Louisiana, with 2 LNG export terminals. And we recently opened our office in Seoul, which is targeting Asia market, including the most important market, which is South Korea. And today I will present some obstacles when foreign companies, they are developing project, especially LNG project in Korea. As John briefly explained, Korean government, they are driving very strongly about energy transition from conventional type to renewable projects. But in transition, in any case, Korean government has to figure out the gap between nuclear and coal and renewables. So according to Power Master Plan 9, by 2034, Korean government or the Jankos and other generation companies, they have to replace 34 existing coal-fired power projects to LNG power plants. That means they have to increase dramatically the import of LNG from overseas. So for that, our company and also other foreign companies, they are trying to develop an LNG project in Korea. But as I mentioned, there are a couple of obstacles that we are facing. So today, I just want to share the overall horizon of LNG business in Korea and what are the obstacles and what should be the suggestions to that to solve that obstacle. Okay, my presentation, they're composed of 4 parts, brief 4 parts. The first one is the market overview and LNG facility overview, and what are the key issues of the Korean energy market and the suggestion. As you see here on the first slide, the total import of LNG into Korea is more or less 40 million tons per year, and 40% of that is used for power generation and the other for district heat. And by the import by the country, if you look at this, around 24 or 30% of LNG is imported from Qatar. And the interesting thing here is the increase of the LNG imported from US. As of now, US placed number 3 in terms of the LNG import, and next to Australia, 5.2 million tons per year. And this one expected to be increased dramatically for the next few years. And the Korean government recently, not recently, several years ago, allowed the end user to import the LNG directly, not through Hughes, but directly from overseas. So as of now, around there's a typo. Around 9.2 million tons per year, they are importing directly from overseas, not through Hughes. And this is the pipeline network in South Korea. The total length of the pipelines, main pipelines of the Hughes, is more or less 5,000 kilometers. And that is composed of 6 injection points and 235 eye-flow points. And as I mentioned here, all of these pipelines are managed and controlled by Hughes. And these are the LNG terminals in South Korea by Hughes, GSK, and POSCO Energy, and also later on by Hanyang and Hyundai. Okay, this is the key issue. Actually, there are a couple of more key issues related to this, but it's better I can share that verbally rather than by document. The reason why I showed you the overall market situation and the pipeline network in Korea is because to explain the issue I mentioned here. Most of the LNG terminal in South Korea are controlled by Hughes and also a couple of private companies. In addition to that, more importantly, the pipelines, which is essential for the delivery of the natural gas, is dominated and monopolized by Hughes. And the issue here is Hughes will be the competitor. And competitor is controlling the main system of natural gas supply in South Korea. That means inevitably there is a discrimination in terms of the access to the pipeline. So without solving this out, new entrance to the market is almost impossible. So as a way to solve this issue, major Korean LNG companies, they formed an association already. But for foreign companies, there is no way up to now to compete against Hughes or against this new organization of major Korean LNG companies. So today I want to suggest the solution. Maybe this solution may not be the ultimate solution, but at least we have to raise this issue to the public. And also we have to share this issue among ourselves. So later on, we can take further steps to figure this issue out. So my suggestion here is, actually I mentioned here too, but I have two other suggestions. First one is Korean government or any authority who is in charge, they have to establish third party, which will evaluate the impact of the access of LNG. Currently, Hughes has the full authority to decide whether they can accept new player or not to their main gas pipeline. It's quite unreasonable because, as I mentioned, Hughes is a supplier and importer of LNG, and also at the same time they are doing the judge whether others they can use their pipeline or not. By law, it is not allowed. I mean, it does not mention which discriminate other players, but in reality, there is a big tendency of Hughes to discriminate other players when they are trying to access to their pipeline. So we have to give this authority to third party. And also at the same time, we have to appeal to policymakers about this matter. Actually, the Congress, especially the Division of Industry, Trade, Natural Resource, and Small and Medium Venture Committee, is very keen on this issue. So a couple of congressmen, they already convened a meeting to solve the issue and also to find out a way how efficiently they can use the main pipelines of Hughes. But they couldn't find a solution, and also the discussion was limited only to disclose the issue. But we have to officially raise this issue from the perspective of the foreign investors. So the first step should be we have to prepare one official letter to the decision makers. Whether there might be a congressman, there might be the government of Korea, MOTI. And in addition to that, what I'm suggesting here is like our own, foreign association who are doing LNG business in Korea. So we can form a quite similar association as major Korean LNG players did before. So we can increase our voice against the government or against other players. And lastly, I want to suggest to our Chamber of Commerce to consider about joint energy Chamber of Commerce. This is a suggestion actually based on my experience in the Philippines before, when the Philippine government has tried to renegotiate all of the PPAs with the power gen IPP players. This joint commerce Chamber of Commerce, they can invite like a congressman or the ministers or other decision makers to a meeting, and we can share our concerns for the investment in Korea. Actually, that's it of my presentation. I'm not quite sure whether my presentation is sufficient enough to raise the issues and suggest the solutions, but believe that at least this is meaningful, that we raise this kind of issue officially to the public. Okay, thank you. If there is any question, please feel free to ask.
Thanks, Ricky. And I think if we can take the questions at the end of the presentations, that's probably the most efficient way to go. But the three actions that you're suggesting in relation to talking to the government about open access to the pipelines, establishing a foreign LNG association, and some kind of a tie-up with the Korean Chamber of Commerce on joint domestic and international companies LNG committee are very interesting, and be interesting to see if there's any comment or questions about that. So having said that, perhaps we can invite our next speaker to take the floor. Thank you. Thanks very much.
John, I'm sorry. Let me clarify the last suggestion. When I said joint energy chamber of commerce, that means foreign joint chamber of commerce.
I see. Okay.
Not with the Korean domestic.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, then I'll give the voice to Ryan.
Yeah. Thanks, Ricky. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, John. My name is Ryan Russell. I am a foreign lawyer at Chang, Korea's largest law firm, and it's a pleasure to be with you this morning and join this conversation. Apologies for my fairly casual get-up. I'm on holiday in the States at the moment. I appreciate your understanding. So this is, of course, a very timely topic, and I'm happy to jump right in. So first, I'd like to take a quick look at Korea's power market generally, see the lay of the land, and then an overview of Korea's energy transition. And then I'd like to look at a few issues by sector. And then if we have time, perhaps some general foreign direct investment considerations in Korea. So I'm going to have to blitzkrieg through many of these slides. The key point is that renewables penetration is, as you know, quite low. Korea has been and remains very reliant on fossil fuels, especially imported fossil fuels, including LNG, which the government has noted will be a key to the transition in Korea. With respect to the primary regulators, as most of you likely know, the MODI, the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy, is the key regulator but there are also other key regulatory bodies that play important roles in the power generation sector. Among them is KEPCO, which is the majority state-owned utility. They have a monopoly on transmission and distribution, essentially, in Korea. Local governments play a key role, as does the Hwanggyangbu, the Ministry of Environment. With respect to offshore wind, the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries is perhaps on par with the MODI as far as importance. They play a very pivotal role, especially with regards to some of the key public waters occupancy permits. And then there are, of course, a few other key regulators as well. Korea's market is a merchant market as far as power generation goes in general. It has been historically since for quite some time. There have been some changes recently. That's why we have the asterisk here. There's been some liberalization with respect to the offtake arrangements, which we'll talk about. But up until this year, essentially any power generator in Korea has sold their generated electricity onto the Korea Power Exchange. These are some of the key statutes that regulate the power generation businesses in Korea. The Electricity Business Act and the Renewable Energy Act are probably fundamental there. We can talk more about that later separately as needed. The key driver of government support for renewable power generation in Korea is the Renewable Portfolio Standards, which mandates that Korea's largest power generators source an annually increasing percentage of all of their generation from renewable sources. Currently, that stands at 9%. It's increasing to 10% next year. But let's talk real quickly about the energy transition policies and what's happening here. The key for the energy transition really took off strong, beginning with the Moon administration. In 2017, the first year of the current presidential administration, the MODI announced what has been termed the RE 3020 plan, which is the first real target with teeth in Korea, which targeted achieving by the year 2030 20% of all generation through renewable energy sources, and that's primarily to be sourced from solar and wind power. Since then, that has increased additionally. They're now looking at 35 to 40% by 2040. So these are some of the key contours of that policy. The transition policies are quite ambitious, especially considering that Korea's renewable penetration has been quite low. Depending on how it's quantified, it's between 4 to 6% currently, although that is quite a step up from where it had been prior to this administration. And there's quite a lot in the pipeline. These are Korea has several long-term energy plans which set out policy objectives, and those have been consistently focused on spurring the transition as strong as possible, as soon as possible. And as Ricky mentioned, LNG is a primary transition source for Korea. The most recent 9th Supply and Demand Basic Energy Overview looked to grow LNG power production, but also much more than that, grow renewables production. And most of that is focused in solar and key offshore wind. The Green New Deal is another key government policy which pushes for government and private investments to expand jobs in the green sector in order to achieve those ambitious goals. And the Korea's RE 100 program was introduced this year. This allows alternative paths to market that had not previously existed, including power purchase agreements for renewable energy projects. Those are being introduced the second half of this year. Now I'd like to talk about some of the key issues by sector, focusing on offshore wind. And right, so there's some common issues that are common across all sectors, not just offshore wind. One of those is local content requirements. I guess on a high level, it's important to note that there currently are no local content requirements in the offshore wind sector or renewable energy sector generally, as a matter of black letter law. However, in practice, that can be not exactly true. There are certain situations where there can be indirect pressure points to encourage use of local players at various points in the value chain for offshore wind. That could potentially include wind turbines, but also, of course, Korea is very strong in other elements of the value chain, particularly subsea cables and towers and other balance of plant components, and of course EPC as well. There's some regulatory uncertainty just given the nascent nature of Korea's renewable sectors, especially offshore wind. And that's being resolved. The government is aware of that, and they're making concerted efforts across various fronts to resolve any uncertainties as soon as possible. And of course, as major projects progress, private parties, private developers and sponsors are also playing a large role in helping to clear up those issues that are a bit ambiguous. One key issue in Korea's renewable sector is the relationship with local players. It's important to note that there are very strong local players across essentially all elements of the value chain. So as a foreign investor coming into the market, to a large extent, your success may depend on the relationships that you're able to form with those local players, whether they be off-takers or joint venture partners or suppliers for your project. So it's key to keep that in mind. One concern that many new players to the market have is whether policies will be consistent. The current administration, as I mentioned, really did beef up renewable supporting schemes. And one question that's often raised is, well, is that just for this 5-year term, which ends next year, or is this something that will likely continue in the foreseeable future? Of course, it's impossible to know for sure, but our best indications would lean towards the latter for several reasons. Really, the push towards renewables has become quite a bipartisan issue. That said, along the fringes, there are some issues, especially, for example, how quickly to phase out coal and what is the future of the nuclear sector. Those are some issues that qualitatively and quantitatively will be different, could be different, depending on who comes to the Blue House in the first half of next year. Another key issue is the role of KEPCO. KEPCO currently is a very important market player, especially with regards to their operation of the transmission and distribution grid. With the introduction of PPAs this year, their role will increase to act as a middleman for synthetic PPAs. There will now be sleeve PPAs, also known as indirect PPAs, which will be available for renewable power producers. And of course, managing the grid, reinforcing the grid to accommodate all of the new, especially large-scale offshore wind projects that are coming on in diverse areas across, especially the southern and southeastern and southwestern shores. That'll be a key role. But really, the key issue here that's not listed is KEPCO's future role in actually generating power. Back in 2000, 2001, prior to that time, KEPCO not only was the major player in T&D, but they were also the major player in power generation. There was a partial liberalization of the market at that time, and KEPCO currently is prohibited from generating power domestically, other than through its 6 GenCo subsidiaries, which really are separate and distinct from KEPCO for all intents and purposes, although they're owned by KEPCO. That said, there was a bill introduced to the National Assembly early this year, I believe, that proposes that KEPCO be allowed to participate in direct generation of renewable energy projects. That's somewhat stalled as far as progressing through the National Assembly for various reasons, mostly because there's so many other renewable energy policies that are moving forward at the same time. And just given the political calendar, there's really not much time to push something of that magnitude prior to the end of this administration. However, it does, I might be stepping out a bit on a limb, but those in the know within the government seem quite certain that this is an eventual certainty, that in order to achieve Korea's ambitious renewable energy targets, KEPCO will have to play a leading role, not only in managing the grid, but also in actually developing especially large-scale offshore wind projects. And of course, that leads to quite a few other questions, right? If KEPCO is managing the grid and if they're also participating in actually developing projects, then what happens to grid neutrality as KEPCO becomes a direct competitor with other renewable projects. With the offshore wind sector specifically, community acceptance is one of the key issues here. The fishermen across the various projects, of course, have legitimate issues that need to be addressed. And the government has been trying to provide guidance on exactly how that can be addressed. But that still remains an open issue to some extent. Permitting has been balkanized. There are several different agencies, both at the national level and locally, that need to be addressed for this. And then the role of KEPCO, if they do end up producing power directly, could potentially be an issue as well. Also, offtake arrangements for renewables generally is somewhat distinct in Korea. Even though starting this year, power purchase agreements will be available, for the foreseeable future, at least for offshore wind, where the LCOE remains quite high, it's likely that the primary path to market will remain the legacy long-term fixed price contracts, which is somewhat of an idiosyncratic contractual arrangement that's in Korea. It does provide revenue certainty over a 20-year period, and so it can essentially get you to the same place as a long-term PPA if done well, if negotiated well. But especially if a project's being financed by foreign lenders, this is something that might take some time in order to explain to the foreign project financiers and get them comfortable with. In order to address these issues, in mid last year, the MODI, the Ministry of the Oceans and Fisheries, and the Ministry of Environment issued a joint collaboration plan with respect to offshore wind, noting that offshore wind really is the key area through which Korea will be able to achieve their ambitious targets. There are several initiatives that come from this, and this still remains a work in progress. It has not been enacted yet, but Initiative 1, the government has pledged to take more of a leading role in siting projects and streamlining permitting. There was another statute that was a bill that was introduced to the National Assembly more recently, a wind power promotion special act, which will promote not just offshore, also onshore, but especially offshore wind. It would create a special committee that could act as a one-stop shop for permitting purposes. This is something that is still in the works, and it could take some time to work out amongst the various government stakeholders, but it does provide some hope for those who would be developing projects here. In addition, the government has pledged to encourage stakeholder acceptance and provide additional clarity on profit sharing models for local stakeholders, and to provide various mechanisms to assist in negotiating with the fishermen associations. Hydrogen, of course, is also coming, waiting in the wings. Korea is leading in hydrogen in many areas. The technology, of course, is not quite as developed as offshore wind technology yet, but that's another issue that, as John mentioned, will be discussed at a future committee meeting. But Korea did just this year have enforced their Hydrogen Act, which introduces a hydrogen portfolio standard, which is a very interesting development. Solar power is also, of course, key to achieving Korea's renewable targets. Perhaps the key issue for solar projects is siting. It's difficult to find acceptable sites in Korea for utility scale projects, and there are various issues with that. There's been a new temporary use permitting scheme that now allows developers to temporarily use reclaimed farmland, which has been reclaimed from the sea, that has high enough salinity levels, and that's promising, but it still hasn't yielded quite the results yet that perhaps the government had hoped for. And also, there was a recent restriction on transferring equity for solar projects after issuance of the key initial license, the electric business license. Up until achievement of COD, there are restrictions on transferring equity, which cause some concerns amongst developers. ESS projects are also hitting a bit of a roadblock at the moment. The special REC multiplier for energy storage systems was phased out in the wake of some fire and insurability issues. Project financing, there are various issues with project financing that kind of relate to what we've already discussed. And I'm going to have to skip over those. And I'm also going to have to skip over most of the general FDI considerations in consideration of time. But I guess the key takeaway that I wanted to note was that it's an exciting time in Korea. There are opportunities. It's in some ways the market here is nascent, but in some ways the market is also very, very well developed and very sophisticated. And so if you're looking to jump in new, it's a great time to do it. You don't want to wait, but you also want to consider all the possibilities, all the options, and make sure that that you maximize your efforts here in Korea. Thank you very much. I think I've gone over time. I'll turn the time back over to John.
Ryan, you've done pretty well, I think, considering the huge amount of territory that you've covered.
I have time for a joke. I have
Please.
One wind turbine joke I'd love to share.
Please.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
All right. So a Doosan wind turbine walked into a bar and saw a beautiful Vestas wind turbine sitting at the bar. So he sauntered up to her, sat down, and his opening line was, "Hey, baby, what kind of music do you like?" The Vestas turbine looked at the Doosan turbine and said, "I'm a big metal fan." All right, that's it. Mic drop.
Thank you. That might be heavy metal fan. Thank you very much, Ryan. Look, I think very, very interesting. The key takeaways for me there is that the need for consistency around the policy environment, the need to appreciate that outside strict policy, there may be some informal or indirect requirements that make it a useful idea to think about tying up with local players. I think the other takeaway for me was the need for policy consistency going forward, irrespective of changes in the Blue House or changes of government. And then the points around the government getting behind the various government agencies collaborating to ensure that things like streamlining of permitting and mechanisms for helping with stakeholder appeals are put in place. So very interesting, a lot of ground covered, and no doubt there'll be a few questions around that. So away from policy and regulation, more towards some more technical aspects of offshore wind in particular. Kevin, if I could invite you to go ahead with your presentation, please.
Thanks a lot, John. And let me just share my screen first. Some great insights from Ryan earlier. Thank you so much for sharing that. A lot of the conversation pieces resonate well with what we do in Baker too. So I'm happy to take the conversation forward, albeit in a slightly different fashion, more of introducing the technologies that we have, especially within the energy transition scheme that we are in. So I'm Kevin Jayanathan, based out of Singapore, but I look after sales for Asia Pacific, including Korea. And we focus in a variety of products that serve upstream, midstream, and downstream operations. And energy transition is part of our narrative that's extremely important. And it's also becoming one of our key objectives to support the conversations to come. So for today, apart from talking about energy transition, I'd just like to introduce one of our key technologies, which is the topic of discussion today, which is our Mekon Power Connector. It's specifically used within the offshore wind segment under the renewables play. And two little pictures at the bottom of the screen, which I hope you could see. One is a dry mate connector and one is a wet mate connector. And just to center the visualization as to how these connectors look like and how they would fit in the slides to come in the overall offshore wind space, which I hope I can walk you through that and see how that actually complements any national transmission and energy agenda that may be. So If I were to move to the next slide, perfect. Baker Hughes is fully committed towards decarbonization. A little bit background about our company. A couple of years ago, we made a mandate and a policy that we are going towards a net zero footprint by 2050, and with an interim goal of hitting 50% of that target by 2030. Very happy to say that at this point of time, in this juncture, 9 years to go, we are hitting that objective reasonably well, and we are very confident in hitting that. The driver for that is driven by our 3 pillars, which we hope would echo into the conversation of offshore wind. So the first is by looking within our organization and our environmental footprint, and looking at how we would minimize, how we would consider, and how we would factor options to reduce our personal footprint to the environment. We look at concurrent engineering to design the sustainability within our products and our services offered. We look at our manufacturing processes, how we manage large projects offshore, subsea, and how does that factor into the global scheme of things. And also, how do we work as a company internally so that this is given a strong focus. So that's the first pillar that we look to in our commitment to decarbonization. Our second pillar is about partnerships, alliances, working with customers, working with governments, working with third-party affiliates. And the goal is to collaborate, to share information, to grow, and to find solutions and options together that can push forward this narrative, which is really important for all of us. And I think the organization of this conversation at AMCHAM is a clear testament that all of us are having the conversations focused on that right objective. So very happy to be a part of that. Our third pillar that we are looking at is about research and development. It's about looking at the technologies that we carry and build, and investing in that. So we at Baker continue to invest on a yearly basis, a specific amount of funds purely for energy transition themes. And the technology that we are sharing with you today, just one of it, which is our Mekon Power Connector, that's actually a result of the research and development that we have done within this space. So that's our commitment, and that's how we would like to be a part of the journey, especially for Korea. So looking into offshore wind, Ryan shared in his earlier notes about the different options and how they would actually feed into the energy scheme of things in Korea, and I thank him for that, because it does provide a good prelude into the conversation that I'm about to share with you. So in enabling offshore wind, or wind energy in general, which is part of energy transition, the narrative has always been closer to the shore, either being onshore or even close to the shore, because of the complexity of stepping out these wind farms. The further you go, you have more project concepts and more options or architectures to be understood, to be factored in, and they can be reasonable to sizable in challenges. One of the key issues is, how do you bring the energy, or the converted energy, back to shore? How do you link it back to the grid? And the challenge has always been, the longer you go, the cables, how do you connect them? How do you make them interface within a subsea environment? These are some of the challenges that may have limited the development of offshore wind to a smaller area, to a more centralized location, and concepts, thoughts, distributed architectures may have not been gone into a greater level. Having said that, with all the new technologies coming into play, especially with Mekon, those options or projects that may have not been deemed feasible in the past is worthy to be brought to consideration. And especially when we are looking at a country like South Korea with a peninsula and such a great opportunity to harness offshore wind, I think this is a great opportunity to relook potentials, to look at different distribution architecture that could actually maximize the value proposition of bringing in offshore wind and supporting onshore grid sources of energy. So in a nutshell, offshore wind is represented by these wind farms over here, if you could see that. And you know, the power of wind is actually converted by a simple dynamo mechanism machine into electrical energy, stored energy, where it needs to be transmitted or transported by a series of cables. And you can see these cables within this diagram. We have two types of cables. You've got a dynamic cable, which is the cable that connects these wind farms to the infrastructure unit at the seabed, which are your static cables. So these dynamic cables would transmit or transfer these stored energy into static cables. And to connect these cables together, we use our Mekon power connector. The beautiful thing about the power connectors that we are sharing with you today, the technology enables two options. The dry mate connector enables these power cables to be connected above sea line, so you could actually mate them or lock them together before installing it offshore. Or you could take a different approach by connecting them while in a subsea environment, i.e. submerged in water, through a wet mate option, which means that these two wet mate connectors would combine two power cables, lock them in within an ocean environment without creating any safety issues, because water is a conductor, it's well insulated, it's mechanically sealed, and it's able to conduct or transmit power through the electricity conduit. So a wet mate and a dry mate connector gives us options. How do you want to build an offshore wind project? How are you going to link up that infrastructure? And how are you going to connect it back to an onshore grid? Which in the past, traditionally, these options would have not been thought possible. They would have been expensive, not feasible. And now with these connectors available, you could think about multiple wind farms being harnessing the power of wind at different locations, connecting all of them together and transmitting it back to an onshore grid system. So that's really the essence of our wet mate and our dry mate connector. And within this diagram, we've also shared something called a power hub over here, which is basically like a router that collects all the generated electrical power and collects it together before feeding it into an onshore grid. And another element that I would like to just highlight a little bit to you, which is a technology that we have, is our substation. And in the next slide, we will share that with you. So this is a simplistic diagram of how offshore wind power could be harnessed and how a distributed architecture could be something that you could consider. So when you have your wind farms, you have your dynamic cables, as we talked about earlier, that transmits or transfers the energy created through a series of power connectors and power hubs, being our Mekon power hub. What we could also potentially do is all these different wind farms at different locations, it could be anywhere from 10 kilometers to 50 kilometers. Your step outs could reach far and wide, you know, as compared to the previous notion of having it very close to offshore only. And what you could do is you could also consider grouping all of these energy created and sending it to a subsea substation. So this is another unique value proposition that in the past may have not been possible. A substation, for just to give you a very high overview, in onshore grid transmission systems, all onshore transmission systems actually have these substations. And the purpose is to step up the voltage so that you have reduced power losses as you transfer electrical energy through large or long ranges, hundreds of kilometers of transmission lines. So we step it up, and the goal is to reduce power losses. The same applies in a subsea environment, in an offshore environment. We could essentially collect the stored energy or the created energy from wind farms, bring it to a subsea substation, transform it or step it up with the step-up transformer, which is completely sealed in an offshore environment within the ocean floor. These are all on the seabed, and then step it up to a higher voltage, generally 220 kilovolts. Some countries' legislations require 275, some require 500. The stepping up ratio is entirely possible for different options. And then we can connect this cable directly to the onshore grid, where it actually is an alternate source of energy for the transmission system of a country. So for Korea, apart from fossil fuels, gas, perhaps hydro, renewables via wind could be an alternate source of energy that feeds the transition grid, and that would serve the needs of the country and the development as such. So the way we look at it is options for wind in the past, which we have not been, didn't generate the right ROI, didn't meet the project requirements. Things have changed as we develop new technology. The technology that's available by connecting all these cables together, substations, power hubs that all work within an offshore subsea environment, can propagate and promote alternates to the thinking of wind projects and actually drive that conversation further. So we hope at Baker at least that some of the technologies that we brought forward are able to support and complement the larger discussion at BEAD. And that's really the technology that we wanted to share with you today. Just one of the many, but I hope it rests well with you. Happy to take any questions or discussions later, which I will pass back to John for that facilitating. And thank you very much for this opportunity. It is a great conversation to be a part of, and looking forward to more. Thank you. Back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Very interesting, and particularly as I think through the ability to reduce power losses for floating offshore wind, which of course are very, very long distance from the shore. And the east coast of Korea is a good example of that, with the new offshore farms being developed off the coast of Ulsan. I think the other thing that occurs to me is that the ability to have the materials and the technology subsea avoid some of the issues with development on land, particularly in areas that are already developed, where installing substations, etc., could become problematic. So thank you. That's very interesting. We have around 5 minutes left. I'm sorry, everyone. So not a lot of time for Q&A, but please feel free to send through your questions. I can't see any questions so far in the Q&A box. Do we have any questions?
If we're waiting for others to come in, could I ask a quick question for Kevin?
Sure.
I was curious, could you quickly just compare and contrast the relative benefits and drawbacks of a subsea substation as compared to a floating substation?
Sure, Ryan. Yep. There's two options over there, subsea versus platform or on a vessel. The benefits of subsea substations is actually the installation. So it becomes a lot easier to plan your system architecture, because on the seabed, when you look at the land and you look at the geometry, it's much easier to actually plan or plant a substation on the seafloor. You'd need some subsea structures or we call it a template manifold that can actually house these substations, and it's relatively rigid. You don't have to worry about dynamic forces. You don't have to worry so much about dynamic positioning, which is when you're in a a vessel, you have to worry about these tensions and distortions, both vertical and horizontal, as there's swag and sway on a vessel. So there's added complications and there's added risk that you have to monitor when you're looking at vessels. Whereas when you lay it on a subsea seabed, those complications they are less. I wouldn't say they're gone, but at least some of the environmental forces that are working on it are reduced. So by doing that, that's one option that we can reduce. Another opportunity is when you lay it on a subsea bed infrastructure, you could have various stages of step-ups. So we could actually reach and harness hundreds of kilometers of communication and transmission lines within a subsea infrastructure through step-up and step-down transformers, and they could all be connecting via an infrastructure on your seabed. And that's an option that may not be economically possible when we're using vessel deployments. So if it's a single architecture, perhaps yes, but if you're looking at a distributed architecture, if you're looking at smaller pockets that we want to harness, laying it on a subsea may be the better approach. I hope that answers your question, Ryan, and gives you some insight too.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee as to whether the subsea substation is available now in the market or not. Kevin, are you able to take that one?
Sure, I am. We have a couple of trial projects in the North Sea, which is where our center of gravity is situated. There are projects that we are tied up with some of our customers over there. Statoil is one of our key customers in the past who have supported us. We have projects with Asgard, with Troll, where we have actually utilized these technologies. So currently the center of gravity is situated over there, where there is a lot of drive, initiative, and momentum towards propelling energy transition, especially in offshore wind. So the answer is yes.
Thank you very much. Brian, are you able to see the Q&A box, or should I pass on the question from Charles Chang? I like it. Okay, Charles Chang is asking, how can Korean corporates meet the renewable energy requirements of RE100 when they cannot produce enough on their own? So large companies may be able to do so, but mid-sized companies have limited resources.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are several options currently for Korean companies looking to achieve sustainability goals to do so. And these are all new that were just implemented this year. Perhaps the easiest would just be to participate in the green pricing options that have been implemented by KEPCO twice this year and probably twice next year as well. For payment of a green premium, which is equal to approximately 10% on top of a normal industrial electricity bill, corporates are able to bid and purchase up to their annual requirements of electricity usage solely from renewable sourced power. If you're looking for something longer term, of course, that doesn't solve the issue, because that's up to an annual usage only. In addition to that, other options that are available, self-generation, of course, is one option, but you alluded to some problems with that. These PPAs that are being introduced this half of the year will provide additional options. Pricing for that is one of the key questions. There will be fees that should be paid to KEPCO, but those are pegged to actual costs that KEPCO would incur for wheeling with respect to those. There also have been yeah, maybe I should leave it there for now. There are several options that are available, and Charles, maybe we can, I know you have my contact, maybe we can talk more about that. There was actually a new announcement just within the last couple of weeks that we could discuss as well.
Great, thank you. There's also a message in the chat box from John Lee from GS Energy, which is in Korean. Sorry, John, my Korean is not good enough to see that, but perhaps I see you've provided your email address, so let's look at that question and reply to you by email, if that's okay. We have come to the end of the hour. Notice there's no further questions, but please, if attendees have got further questions or observations or reactions to the suggestions being made, please feel free to email through or contact myself or any of the speakers, or obviously the team AMCHAM. It seems we've come to the end of the meeting. So thank you very much, Ricky, Kevin, and Ryan for your time and effort that you put in today. And we look forward to the future meetings and talking about some of the issues in this very interesting sector of the energy transition. Thank you again. Have a great day, everybody, and look forward to the next meeting. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye. Thank you, AMCHAM. Thank you, team.